So I think we kind of came to the conclusion last week that Jesus is not the complete antithesis to the Old Testament that he seems to be, that perhaps the Old Testament has a little bit of a different message than we tend to assume. But there are still some challenges to that conclusion when we get into the New Testament, and I want to look at some of that today. So I want to focus primarily on the beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, which is in Matthew chapter 5. So we're going to start there today in Matthew chapter 5. And I want to look at some of what Jesus says, where he starts with, "You have heard that it was said, blah, 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 but I say to you," because it seems that Jesus is in some ways countering, in other ways upping the ante on what the Old Testament has to say to us. So we're going to read Matthew chapter 5. We're going to start with verse 21 and go through verse 48. So that's a little bit of a long one, so we can probably split that up if we'd like. Any volunteers who'd be willing to give it a go for a little bit, starting in chapter 5, verse 21?
Start.
We'll start it out here.
Go ahead, Ben.
Okay, 5:21. You have heard it said to the people long ago, "Do not murder, and anyone who murders will be subject to judgment." But I tell you that anyone who is angry with his brothers will be subject to judgment. Again, anyone who says to his brother, "Raka," is answerable to the Sanhedrin. But anyone who says, "You fool," will be in danger of the fire of hell. Therefore, if you are offering your gift at the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there in front of the altar. First go and be reconciled with your brother, then come and offer your gift. Settle matters quickly with your adversary who is taking you to court. Do it while you are still with him on the way, or he may hand you over to the judge, and the judge may hand you over to the officer, and you may be thrown into prison. I tell you the truth, you will not get out until you have paid the last penalty. You have heard that it is said, "Do not commit adultery." But I tell you, anyone who looks at a woman lustfully has already committed adultery with her in his heart. If your right eye causes you to sin, gouge it out and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to be thrown into hell. And if your right hand causes you to sin, cut it off and throw it away. It is better for you to lose one part of your body than for your whole body to go into hell. It has been said, anyone who divorces his wife must give her a certificate of divorce. But I tell you that anyone who divorces his wife, except for marital unfaithfulness, causes her to become an adulteress, and anyone who marries the divorced woman commits adultery. All right, you can go ahead there.
Like me to pick it up there?
Yep.
Okay. Again, you have heard that it was said to the people long ago, "Do not break your oath, but keep the oaths you have made to the Lord." But I tell you, do not swear at all, either by heaven, for it is God's throne, or by the earth, for it is his footstool, or by Jerusalem, for it is the city of the great King. And do not swear by your head, for you cannot make even one hair white or black. Simply let your yes be yes and your no, no. Anything beyond this comes from the evil one. You have heard that it was said, "Eye for eye and tooth for tooth." But I tell you, do not resist an evil person. If someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. And if someone wants to sue you and take your tunic, let him have your cloak as well. If someone forces you to go 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Give to the one who asks you, and do not turn away from the one who wants to borrow from you. You have heard that it was said, love your neighbor. Love your neighbor and hate your enemy. But I tell you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you, that you may be sons of your Father in heaven. He causes the sun to rise on the evil and the good, and sends rain on the righteous and the unrighteous. If you love those who love you, what reward will you get? Are not even the tax collectors doing that? And if you greet only your brothers, what are you doing more than others? Do not even pagans do that? Be perfect, therefore, as your heavenly Father is perfect.
Okay. So, having read a lot of these passages from the Old Testament that we've been looking at through this lens of what is violence and how does it happen and who perpetrates it and what does the Bible mean when it talks about these things from the perspective of the Old Testament, what do you hear here when you hear these sayings of Jesus when he's speaking about the past?
Maybe the way that things have been said in the past is not the way that it should be, and that he's telling them the right way to feel about these things.
Okay, so Jesus is maybe is upping the ante, maybe is in some ways reversing or sometimes kind of surpassing the commands of the Old Testament.
But he's bringing it forward, so there's a thread of connection.
Okay, what
It's-
kind of connections do you see? Like, just give us
Oh.
an example of one of them, Pam.
Well, basically, he just says, "You're familiar with, you've heard, you know," and then he goes forward. So it's not a total divorce situation. It's like it's a continuation, a growth.
Okay. So some of them, he seems to be perhaps just giving us interpretations, giving us how to apply these general rules to a particular situation. For example, you shall not murder, but I say to you, if you're angry with a brother or sister, you'll be liable to judgment. So not reversing the law, you shall not murder, but kind of deepening the interpretation of what that means. How is it that our regular everyday behavior involves itself in the spirit, perhaps, of that law? But then we have some other ones that are a little bit further down that seem to do something different. For example, verse 38 and 39, or verse 43 and 44. You have heard an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, do not resist an evildoer. Or you have heard that it was said, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, but I say to you, love your enemies and pray for those who persecute you. So what do you think's going on there? Do you think that is, like Karen said, a kind of repudiation of the Old Testament? Or do you think there's something else going on there?
I don't think he's repudiating the Old Testament. I think he's adding to it out to the nth degree, which follows the love your neighbor as yourself, comma. I think he's just telling you what this means. He's itemizing what it means to love your neighbor.
Okay. So even if the Bible at some point says, or the interpretation of the law that he had at the time says, you shall love your neighbor and hate your enemy, Jesus is suggesting perhaps that even your enemy is your neighbor. And so the way that we're supposed to interpret this is a little bit different than the way that you have been interpreting it in the past. So perhaps we can look at this not as a new thing that Jesus is doing, but that he is providing a framework for how to interpret.
Yeah, very much so in that particular one. And he goes into, specifics about, he even talks about the tax collectors, which I think were the most vile people in their minds probably at the time.
Mhm. Yes, not great humans most of the time.
He talks about, what are you doing if you're just greeting your brothers? He compares them to pagans.
Mm-hmm. So I find this this stuff at the end very interesting, partially because it is it on the face of it, it seems incredibly simplistic. We talk about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth, but I say to you, if anyone strikes you on the right cheek, turn the other also. If anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the second mile. Give to everyone who begs from you. Do not refuse anyone who wants to borrow from you. This, I think on the face of it, it's easy to say, yeah, of course, this is how we're supposed to behave. But I think, when we start getting into more detail, giving actual examples for this, it becomes a little bit more challenging. For example, in verse 41, if anyone forces you to go 1 mile, go also the second mile. This is likely a reference to the Roman occupation. Many times, if a century was coming through, if troops were coming through your town, and you were unlucky enough to be caught, outside of your house, one of the soldiers might say, "You there, come over here right now," and make you carry all of his gear for him out of the town and as far as he wanted you to do it. And it was expected that you would just, of course, I'll do this. You are a Roman, you are, a Roman citizen, you are in the armed forces, and so I'm supposed to obey anything that you say to me. And so you're supposed to do this. And of course, this was, not something that the people who were occupied anywhere particularly liked. If you're, outside trying to get something done, you're gardening or taking care of your sheep or painting your front door or whatever it is you're doing, and some guy who you already don't like because he's, part of the occupation, part of the oppression of your people, forces you to come over and carry his stuff for him, you're going to do it very begrudgingly. You're going to do, you're probably going to do it, because if not, he might, he has the right to kill you, or hurt you in some way. But now Jesus is saying, if you're forced to go 1 mile with this guy and then he releases you, you should keep going. And I don't know that I have that in me.
Yeah, but you're not supposed to. I heard at some point that you weren't supposed to do that. So that was really like an in-your-face kind of a move.
What, that going the second mile is?
Yeah. I heard that in the Bible study someplace, and I thought, oh, that's interesting. So that would be really disobedient and being like Jesus was, like making a point.
Perhaps. I've never heard it interpreted that way.
If I find out where I heard that, I'll let you know.
Yeah, please do. So I want to get to another example of this and talk a little bit more about this, this idea about, no retaliation, by looking at, this is going to be a little bit of a sneak peek, looking at the book of 1 Peter, the letter of 1 Peter, chapter 2, And we're going to read verses 21 to 25.
1 Peter.
Got the first Peter part. What's the next part, Katie?
Chapter 2, verse 21.
Okay.
I could do it.
Great. Thank you, Karen.
For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. He committed no sin, and no deceit was found in his mouth. When he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. He himself bore our sins in his body on the cross, so that free from sins, we might live for righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed. For you were going astray like sheep, but now you have returned to the shepherd and guardian of your souls.
Right. Thank you. So
Katie, which one was that?
this is 1 Peter chapter 2,
Oh,
verses 21 through 25.
Okay.
So this is just one example that we can find throughout the New Testament of the followers of Christ, of the writers who came after him, interpreting Jesus's behavior using the words of Jesus. So Jesus says, turn the other cheek. If you get smacked, don't smack back. Turn the other cheek and say, would you like to smack the other one? If you are forced into labor by someone that you hate, say, oh, well, I'll gladly do whatever it is that you ask of me. Love your neighbors, do not hate your enemies, love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. What they're doing here and in many other places in the New Testament is they are connecting those teachings of Jesus to his life, his entire life, and especially his death and refusal to retaliate against those who were beating him, scorning him, putting him on the cross. So I think, kind of as a general rule, this makes sense. Jesus is, setting us to a higher standard than the pagans, he says, than the Gentiles, than those who don't follow Jesus. And that's not anything new to any of us. That's kind of standard Christian stuff. And Jesus, doesn't just say it. He doesn't just tell us to do these things. He does it. He does it to such a degree that he ends up dying for it, because he doesn't commit sin. He does not return abuse. He does not threaten. And then it tells us why. What is it that we're supposed to do instead in verse 23? It says, when he was abused, he did not return abuse. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. And so this kind of takes us back to what we've been talking about with violence, because if we remember that violence, as defined in the Bible, is attempting to usurp God's place, to take God's position, to take matters into our own hands when those matters belong to God, then wouldn't threatening and returning abuse and taking any kind of retaliatory action against anyone who is hurting us, wouldn't that be doing violence? Because according to this, it's God's place to retaliate. It's God's place to judge. And so the interpretation here is that Jesus did not take any of these actions because instead he entrusted himself to the one who judges justly. We can't take any of these actions ever, because if we do, we are doing violence to our relationship with God and our trust in God. And on the face of it, that seems okay. But I want to back up a couple of verses here to make this a little bit more real. So starting in verse 18, my version says, "Slaves, accept the authority of your masters with all deference, not only to those who are kind and gentle, but also those who are harsh. For is it a credit to you if, being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly? If you endure when you are beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval." And then it goes into this interpretation of Christ. "For to this you have been called, because Christ also suffered for you, leaving an example so that you should follow in his steps." So kind of in general, and especially for people like us that are, for the most part, not being beaten or thrown onto crosses or coerced into acting in particular ways,
Yeah.
we can kind of take on this this radical pacifism. If anybody is can be accused of being a pacifist, first of all, it would be Jesus in these kinds of passages. But when we apply it in real life situations, it gets a little bit more challenging. Slaves have to accept the cruelty of their masters without doing anything to defend themselves. They are supposed to endure when they're beaten for no reason. When they are unjustly treated by their masters, they are to just take it because that's what Jesus did. And then, perhaps more so for people like us who are in positions of privilege, are we then not to get involved if we see something happening that is not just? So, if we are walking down the street and we see that person who's been being beaten by bandits on the side of the road, are we not to intervene? Are we to allow that person to be treated that way? If we see injustice happening in our world, are we not to take any kind of action to fight against it? Are we never to get involved? Are we not to step in between people who are fighting each other, especially when somebody is clearly getting beaten up?
No. Hey, Katie.
Yeah.
I looked it up, and according to Roman law, soldiers could demand that people carry their stuff for 1 mile, no more. So when Jesus told them to walk 2, that was kind of being assertive, I guess. So that's where it came from.
Okay. So there's a possibility there that he's telling them to kind of be do malicious compliance, passive aggressive.
Well, making a point, I guess.
Yeah. Passive aggressive point making. I like that. That's good. That's good.
Well, but I don't understand this thing of just being beaten and taking it and not even saying anything back or trying to avoid it or just to help somebody who's being beaten, or
Yeah.
I don't understand where that comes from in relationship to how does that equate to love, I guess.
Yeah.
If we're supposed to love everybody, we just let them get,
I mean,
broken.
at some point you should be standing up for what's right, which is why you do help the person being beaten by the robber or whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then you get back to how do you know what is right?
Yeah.
Have you ever intervened in a situation and found out you were on the wrong side? I have, because you don't know.
In potential danger, which is scary.
Yeah. But to me, this seems very focused on the future. That, does it matter that there are people who are starving on the street, even though our world has plenty of food to feed everyone? Is that fine because what happens in this world doesn't matter? All we care about is what's to come and the reward that we and those people who are wronged will get later.
Mhm.
This says, if you endure when you were beaten for doing wrong, what credit is that? But if you endure when you do right and suffer for it, you have God's approval. Who cares? Why do I care in this particular moment? When I'm getting beaten by my master as a slave, and it's not my fault. I didn't do anything wrong. And, I'm getting all these lashes. My skin is literally cracking open. Oh, well, I can comfort myself knowing that I have God's approval. That just...
That's what Jesus did,
It is. And
but
so
at the same time, then you struggle with, well, what about self-defense?
Yeah. What about self-defense or I think more problematic for me, because, nobody's beating me with rods or whips, is what do I do when I feel that I need to defend someone else? What do we do with all of these wars that as Americans we've gotten ourselves involved in because we feel that it's right to defend the defenseless, to get involved when a dictator is, hurting the population of a particular country.
And sometimes we're not on the right side, like Karen just said.
Yeah. And I think that's, that to make it as simple as possible, the answer is, well, that's why you don't get involved, because that's God's place. That's not your place.
Right.
But I really struggle with that a lot.
Yeah.
This is really practical right now because, okay, this is a hypothetical, but if you have an election and people from other states are asking you for money, there's this part of me that says that's really the purview of the people in that state.
Mm.
But the outcome could be not what you want if you just leave it to people. So I mean, it's there all the time, hypothetically.
Yeah, it's a real challenge. So some scholars read what Jesus said in, for example, the Sermon on the Mount that we just looked at, as really only applying in particular circumstances. And we've already talked about those types of circumstances. So let's go next to Luke chapter 10.
Okay.
You have a verse you want us to go to?
We're going to look at verses 21 to 24. Anybody feeling up to reading that?
I'll do it. Okay.
All right.
At that, Jesus rejoiced, exuberant in the Holy Spirit. I thank you, Father, Master of heaven and earth, that you hid these things from the know-it-alls and showed them to these innocent newcomers. Yes, Father, it pleased you to do it this way. That's 21. More?
No, that's good enough.
Okay.
So the word that you read, these innocent newcomers, the word that I have in my translation is infants. Does anybody else have that or something similar?
I have little Children.
Yeah, children.
So that word infants, literally in the original Greek, the word is nepios, and the literal translation of that is those who cannot speak, or those who have no voice. And so I think that what the scholars who kind of interpret Jesus as speaking to specific situations, they kind of pull things like this, because Jesus talks a lot about children. He talks about the nepios, the infants. He talks about little children. Let the little children come to me. He talks about older children and youth as being special. And so they use this and some other arguments, but this particular argument I think is helpful for the thread that we've kind of been weaving through the Testaments. Those who have no voice. And who is that we've talked about ad nauseum almost at this point? The people who have no power in the society are the poor, the orphans, the widows, the ill, those who are oppressed by these powerful nations. And so when Jesus is talking about the infants, those who have no voice, those who have no say, those who have no power, it's possible that in these situations, Jesus is telling us, that it is for them. The audience that he originally would have had for something like the Sermon on the Mount would not have been the people in power. The kings, the governors, the centurions would not have been there listening to him speak. This would have been the poor country people who were oppressed, who were being taxed to death, who were barely surviving in the political and cultural environment in which they found themselves. And so Jesus knew that there were people called the Zealots at the time who really wanted to get rid of these Romans, overthrow the oppressors, and establish a new kingdom. They missed the days of the Maccabees when they had their own control over their own lives. And so it's possible that you can interpret this from that perspective, that Jesus is telling them, no, the most effective way to make change is not to violently overthrow, to respond with retaliation and spite. I know what's going to happen if you do that. If you try to take action against these Romans, they're just going to come in and they're going to pummel you. You are going to be completely destroyed. The best way to resist is not in a nonviolent way. And so we can see echoes of that in, for example, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, that the way to enact change is not to violently respond, but to show the world what's happening, to express to a wider audience the injustice of what's going on so that change can come. And that makes sense to me. But there's also no, hard, fast evidence that that's what Jesus meant. And of course, we don't know. We can't go back and ask Jesus to clarify exactly what it is that he's talking about here. And so it is possible that Jesus is talking about all situations at all times in all places, because like we talked about with the violence thing, who am I to step in? This is not my fight. This is God's fight. And so I need to stay out of the way. But then we also know that God uses humans to do God's will in the world. And so it's not an easy thing to decide how to respond to violence in real situations, in real life. It's easy to say when we're sitting in our comfortable chairs talking about it, well, of course we shouldn't retaliate. Of course we shouldn't do violence. Of course we should turn the other cheek. But when you're in that situation, or when you're viewing someone else's suffering, then what is your obligation? What is your call? What does God want us to do?
But then it's kind of odd, unless he's speaking metaphorically, that it's better to have your hand cut off, your eye put out, lest you do more wrong. I mean, you're doing all this violence to yourself.
Yeah.
I'm having a hard time with that.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. It's a challenging thing to try to wrestle with this stuff and reconcile all of these different elements. This is this Matthew chapter 5 starts the Sermon on the Mount with the Beatitudes, which of course, we're all familiar with. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are the meek. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. Blessed are the merciful. Blessed are the pure in heart. Blessed are the peacemakers. And then it said, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And then this one's kind of considered to be the summary. Blessed are you when people revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward is great in heaven, for in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you. So again, your reward is great in heaven. Is that it? Is that all we get? Is this world supposed to be fleeting and meaningless and filled with as much suffering as we can get our hands on, because the more we suffer, the more our reward will be in heaven? Or is there something to be said for, changing the behaviors of the people in our world, for speaking out against what we see to be injustice when we have the power to do so?
but we're supposed to make things on earth as they are in heaven.
Yeah. So it's a challenge. It's hard it's a hard path to walk.
Don't you think speaking out is kind of, in a sense, suffering? Sometimes the easy way out is just say, someone else could deal with that.
Yeah, because you're putting yourself in danger to, by speaking up, and
Not necessarily in danger, but,
well, in various types of danger.
You can see families that need help or kids that need help and not do anything.
Mm.
If you're helping, it's kind of cutting into your other stuff, or
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, and depending on who you help or how you help them, you might put yourself at risk of having your friends not like the way you're behaving, or having other people judge you harshly for the decisions that you're making. That's kind of a form of suffering and loss.
I'm just trying to think outside the box here.
Yeah, no, it's a real challenge for sure to think through some of these things. So let's look next at I don't want to read all of that. No, let's not look at that one. I'm not feeling that. Let's look at let's go back to Matthew chapter 5. And so this stuff that we just read before, with verses 21 and following, is preceded immediately by Jesus speaking about his relationship to the previous writings, the Torah and the prophets. Therefore, what he's talking about is what we now call the Old Testament. And so starting in verse 17, he says, "Do not think that I have come to abolish the law or the prophets. I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill. For truly I tell you, until heaven and earth pass away, not one letter, not one stroke of a letter will pass from the law until all is accomplished. Therefore, whoever breaks one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. For I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So we've looked at the Old Testament from this perspective of, some of it is perhaps not meant to be read literally. Some of it's maybe meant to be read from the perspective of spiritual growth. We've read, we've kind of got some options in there about kind of choosing which passages and which verses are more binding and the lenses through which we ought to read some of the other stuff. We talk about, we've talked about how God chose the people of Abraham and then, kind of chose Jesus to bring that blessing that God desires for all nations. But then we've also got places where it seems like God wants or even demands that peoples be wiped out, peoples be destroyed, peoples be, violence done against certain peoples. And so when we think about that, what do you think it means that Jesus says, I have come not to abolish, but to fulfill? What does it mean to fulfill the law and the prophets?
Live a perfect life.
Say more about that, Ben. What does perfect mean?
I mean that a sinless life.
I'm going to keep pushing. What do you mean by sin?
Well, what I'm saying is that unless you the last verse, unless you surpass the Pharisees and the teachers of the laws, you will certainly not enter the kingdom of heaven. And I think he came to show that this could be done for us, and that he is what we are to follow and be like.
Okay. So you're saying that the law itself, the laws, the list of do's and don'ts can be accomplished, and that if we follow Christ, then we can easily, or maybe not so easily, take care of that.
Well,
Is that
I don't know. I
Sounds
think
like you've almost got to be OCD. Really. Are there some passages in here where we get to see Jesus being human and how he handles errors in judgment? I can't think of anything right now. I mean, someplace where we kind of get a break to know how we can emulate him, since we're not OCD and we can't do all this good stuff all the time 100%.
Well, I have a problem with the fact that you can't do anything to get yourself into heaven except love God. And so the deeds of the law seem to me to be not what we should be striving for, not trying to be perfect under the law, because we can't. All we can do is give our life to God. So I don't understand this. I don't understand this back and forth of you need to do all this and be better than the Pharisees.
Well, remember, a lot of the time, he always made the Pharisees out to be hypocrites in that they had their laws, but
Yes.
they behaved differently. But they,
Yes.
the rules that they had. So
Right.
I think
You're not
part of
supposed
it
to do
is,
that either. It's
so
down. I just was reading that. You're not supposed to do that either. Just say what you mean.
he knew that they were fakers.
Yeah.
take a look at verse 20. I don't know if you all have the same word as me, but mine says, for I tell you, unless your righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. So
Right.
what does righteousness mean? Does anyone remember from our looking and reading? What is righteousness?
Isn't it being in tune with God?
Mm-hmm. So who are the righteous people? Most of them.
The ones who try to follow. The ones who try to follow him. No?
Anybody
the poor.
remember?
The poor. The poor and the needy. I remember
Yes.
now.
Yes. So we read righteousness and we think, well, we've got to do something, right? We've got to behave in a righteous way. But if we are using the definition of the term righteous as it is used in, for example, the Psalms, then what Jesus is saying here is, unless you are poor, unless you are under the law, unless you are under the yoke, unless you are being oppressed in some way, unless you are participating in the world as someone who is not succeeding in the world, whether by necessity, because that's the position you're in, or more rarely by choice, someone who has given up their power, given up their violence, given up everything that they have acquired for themselves. Unless you do those things, you will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And so if we use that definition, now we're back to Jesus isn't talking about being, the way we behave. Jesus is talking about our position in relation to God. Are we dependent upon God because this world has nothing to offer us? Do we have no other way to survive than to cry out and ask for God's help because we have either found ourselves or put ourselves in that kind of position? Or are we people who hang our hats on something else? The scribes and Pharisees would have, from the perspective of the Bible, been the ones who were hanging their hats on their own ability to follow all the rules to the perfect T. But that's not the only way to be unrighteous, to be wicked. You can hang your hat on your own power, hang your hat on your ability to connive or lie or cheat or steal your way through to get what you want and what you need. And so maybe that gives us a little bit of clarity about what's going on here.
Okay, so Kay, let's say you're just a regular landowner. You're not poor or needy. So can you be righteous? Or is that just a whole different category if you have some power or status in society?
So how do you use that power and status in society? There are laws in the Old Testament that dictate that if you are a landowner, when you are gleaning in your field, you're to leave 10% or something of your gleanings on the ground so that the poor can follow behind and pick it up.
Okay.
And if you don't do that, then you're being selfish. You are, keeping all the profit for yourself. So in terms of that, there's nothing wrong with, being successful, owning land, being able to sell your grain. But how do you handle that? How do you use that which has been given to you? Do you suck every kernel of corn out of the field that you can so that you can make every penny you can make? Or do you make available to those who can't afford to buy it without, asking them, oh, well, are you worthy to pick up behind me, or are you just trying to get something more for yourself than you deserve? But I think this is where we get, it's easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to enter the kingdom of heaven. Because from the perspective of the Bible, when you're poor, when you're outcast, when you have no power, you have no choice but to lean on God. You have no choice but to be in right relationship to God, completely dependent on God, because you can't depend on yourself. You have nothing to help yourself with. As soon as you've got something, then you are no longer required, you are no longer obligated to depend on God, because now you've got this other thing that you could depend on. And so then it becomes more difficult to stay in that right relationship with God. And it becomes, the challenges of navigating how much is enough for me, how much should I be giving away, how much of my time is enough for me, how much of my time should I be giving away, how much of my wealth is enough for me, how much of my wealth should I be giving away. Should I be living in this house that has an entire room for books to live in? Or should I be living in a smaller house so that I can use that money to support others? Or should I renovate this room and turn it into a space for somebody who doesn't have a place to live and let them live here? That would be dangerous. Letting some random person who may or may not have mental illness and drug addiction stay in the room right next to my children. I'm not doing that. But is that what I should be doing? I don't know.
Man, you're a mess.
I am.
But I think God calls you to do different things. I mean, not everybody would be comfortable. In fact, I don't know very many people that would be comfortable opening their home to a complete stranger to come and move in with them.
Even in regular years.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so, but there may be some other way to help that person. And one of those ways is using the facilities and the resources of the community, and working to set those things up for people who don't have, and there's lots of different ways to help, but I don't think God would expect us to do things that we're not able to do. But he does expect us to do things we are able to do.
Mm.
I don't know.
So I just find this really interesting, this whole moving into the New Testament and talking about Jesus from the perspective of pacifism and anti-violence, because I felt like, okay, we've gone through all this stuff about violence and it's been really difficult, and we've had a lot of questions that we can't answer. Now we're going to go to the other side and we're going to talk about, what does peace look like? What does what does it look like to be like Jesus and follow Jesus? But I don't think that's any easier. I think it's
What in the heck did he mean when he said walk the second mile?
I think it's harder to think about not retaliating, to think about, how do we live in the world? How do we live in the world in relationship to violence is one question that we've been talking about this whole time. But now we've got the question, how do we live in the world in relationship to nonviolence, to the, to the way that Jesus lived, to the example and witness of Christ? I think this is even harder a question than the other question.
So one thing that you think you could always do would be to always be truthful, but it turns out sometimes that's hard also. It seems simple and nonviolent, but not in all cases.
No. When my kid brings me a craft project that isn't looking too great, am I supposed to say, gosh, you really didn't do your best work there, did you?
No.
That would be the truth. But probably that would be doing violence to my relationship with my kid, right?
then it's going back to what is violence
Yep.
and taking, was it drawing away from God or drawing towards God? And so that helps me sort those two questions out a bit.
Good answer, Pat. All right. Anything else for today?
Well, have a good week next week.
Yes, we will not meet on Thanksgiving for our next gathering.
Why, is
But
everybody doing something?
I will probably be sleeping by this point.
Just kidding.
Napping on the couch. No, so we'll skip next week, and then the week after that we are going to talk about Jesus again, and we're going to talk about Pam, you asked, where are the examples of Jesus being human and dealing with some of these dummies that he was surrounded by, and we're going to talk some about that. We're going to talk about, we've got this image of Jesus as the great pacifist, but then we've also got passages where we can see Jesus as a vengeful God, as one who is doing violence. And we tend to not focus our attention so much on those, but I'd like us to look at a little bit of that, to wrestle with that a little bit next time. So we have that to look forward to. You can ponder over all of this for the next 2 weeks, and then we'll be back on, what is that, like December 3rd or something like that?
Yeah, so December 3rd, yeah.
Okay.
Giving Tuesday is December 1st, so yeah.
Yes. All
I
right.
remember when you put this Bible study out there, and I was thinking, oh, it'll be 4 weeks or something, and then I saw how good heavens. So here we are.
Yeah, this is week 14.
Really?
Yeah. Time flies when you're having fun.
Yeah.
Jeez.
All right. Well, thanks everybody. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving, whatever it is you're planning on doing.